Hello, everyone, and welcome to White Fang Wednesday, where I'll be actually reading uh, White Fang in just a few moments. But right now, I'm going to let people know that I'm reading White Fang, and I'll be right back. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to reading this. And as usual, I'm going to go ahead and use my narration voice. Chapter 4: The Wall of the World. By the time his mother began leaving the cave on hunting expeditions, the cub had learned well the law that forbade his approaching the entrance. One moment while I make sure. One moment while I make sure that the capture is picking up my voice. It is. Good. Okay. Not only had this law been forcibly and many times impressed on him by his mother's nose and paw, but in him the instinct of fear was developing. Never in his brief cave life had he encountered anything of which to be afraid. Yet fear was in him. It had come down to him from a remote ancestry, though through 1,000 lives. It was a heritage he had received directly from One Eye and the She-Wolf, but to them, in turn, it had been passed down through all the generations of wolves that had gone before. Fear. That legacy of the wild which no animal may escape, nor exchange for pottage. So the grey cub knew fear, though he knew not the stuff of which fear was made. Possibly he accepted it as one of the restrictions of life, for he had already learned there was such restrictions. Hunger he had known, and when he could not appease his hunger he had felt restriction. The hard obstruction of the cave wall, the sharp nudge of his mother's nose, the smashing stroke of her paw, the hunger unappeased of several famines, had borne in upon him that all was not freedom in the world, that to life there were limitations and restraints. These limitations and restraints were laws. To be obedient to them was to escape hurt and make for happiness. He did not reason the question out in this man fashion. He merely classified the things that hurt and the things that did not hurt, and after such classification he avoided the things that hurt, the restrictions and restraints, in order to enjoy the satisfactions and the reminiscences of life. Thus it was that, in obedience to the law laid down by his mother, and in obedience to the law of that unknown and nameless thing, fear, he kept away from the mouth of the cave. It remained to him a white ball of light. When his mother was absent, he slept most of the time, while during the intervals that he was awake he kept very quiet, suppressing the whimpering cries that tickled in his throat and strove for noise. Once, lying awake, he heard a strange sound in the white wall. He did not know that it was a wolverine, standing outside, all a-trembling with its own daring, and cautiously scenting out the contents of the cave. The cub knew only that the sniff was strange, a something unclassified, therefore unknown and terrible. For the unknown was one of the chief elements that went into the making of fear. The hair bristled up on the grey cub's back, but it bristled silently. How was he to know that this thing that sniffled was a thing at which to bristle? It was not born of any knowledge of his, yet it was the visible expression of fear that was in him, and for which, in his own life, there was no voting. But fear was accompanied by another instinct, that of concealment. The cub was in a frenzy of terror, yet he lay without movement or sound, frozen, petrified into immobility. To all appearances dead, his mother, coming home, growled as she smelled the wolverine's track, and bounded into the cave and licked and nozzled him with undue vehemence of affection. And the cub felt that somehow he had escaped a great hurt. But there were other forces at work in the cub, the greatest of which was growth. Instinct and law demanded of him obedience, but growth demanded disobedience. His mother and fear impelled him to keep away from the white wall. Growth is life, and life is for ever destined to make for light. So there was no damming up the tide of life that was rising within him, rising with every mouthful of meat he swallowed, with every breath he drew. In the end, one day, fear and obedience were swept away by the rush of life, and the cub straddled and sprawled toward the entrance. Unlike any other wall with which he had experience, this wall seemed to recede from him as he approached. No hard surface collided with the tender little nose he thrust out tentatively before him. The substance of the wall seemed as permeable, as yielding as light, and as condition in his eyes had the seeming of form, so he entered into what had been wall to him, and bathed in the substance that composed it. It was bewildering. He was sprawling through solidity, solidity, and ever the light grew brighter. Fear urged him to go back, but growth drove him on. Suddenly he found himself at the mouth of the cave, the wall inside which he had thought himself has suddenly leaped back before him to an immeasurable distance. The light had become painfully bright. He was dazzled by it. Likewise, he was made dizzy by this abrupt and tremendous extension of space. Automatically, his eyes were adjusting themselves to the brightness, focusing themselves to meet the increased distance of objects. At first, the wall had leaped beyond his vision. He now saw it again, but it had taken upon itself a remarkable remoteness. Also, its appearance had changed. It was now a variegated wall, composed of the trees that fringed the stream, the opposing mountains that towered above the trees, and the sky that out-towered the mountain. A great fear came upon him. This was more of the terrible unknown. He crouched down on the lip of the cave and gazed out on the world. He was very much afraid. Because it was unknown, it was hostile to him. Therefore, the hair stood up on end along his back, and his lips wrinkled weakly in an attempt at a ferocious and intimidating snarl. Out of his puniness and fright, he challenged and menaced the whole wide world. Nothing happened. He continued to gaze, and in his interest he forgot to snarl. Also, he forgot to be afraid. For the time, fear had been routed by growth, while growth had assumed the guise of curiosity. He began to notice near objects, an open portion of the stream that flashed in the sun, the blessed pine tree that stood at the base of the slope, and the slope itself, that ran right up to him, and ceased 2 feet beneath the lip of the cave on which he crouched. Now the grey cub had lived all his days on a level floor. He had never experienced the hurt of a fall. He did not know what a fall was. So he stepped boldly out upon the air. His hind legs still rested on the cave lip. So he fell forward, head downward. The earth struck him a harsh blow on the nose that made him yelp. Then he began rolling down the slope, over and over. He was in a panic of terror. The unknown had caught him at last. It had gripped savagely hold of him, and was about to wreak upon him some terrific hurt. Growth was now routed by fear, and he keyed like any frightened puppy. The unknown bore him on he knew not to it frightful hurt, and he yelped and keyed unceasingly. This was a different proposition from crouching in frozen fear while the unknown lurked just outside. Now the unknown had caught tight hold of him. Silence would do no good. Besides, it was not terror. It was not fear, but terror that convulsed him. But the slope grew more gradual, and its base was grass-covered. Here the cub lost momentum. When at last he came to a stop, he gave one last agonizing yelp, and then a long whimpering wail. Also, and quite as a matter of course, as though in his life he had already made 1,000 toilets. He proceeded to lick away the dry clay that soiled him. After that he sat up and gazed about him, as might the first man of the earth who landed upon Mars. The cub had broken through the wall of the world. The unknown had let go its hold of him, and here he was without hurt. But the first man on Mars would have experienced less unfamiliarity than did he. Without any antecedent knowledge, without any warning whatever that such existed, he found himself an explorer in a total new world. Now that the terrible unknown had let go of him, he forgot that the unknown had any terrors. He was aware only of curiosity and all the things about him. He inspected the grass beneath him, the mossy berry plant just beyond, and the dead trunk of the blasted pine that stood on the edge of an open space among the trees. A squirrel, running around the base of the trunk, came full upon him, and gave him a great fright. He cowered down and snarled. But the squirrel was as badly scared. It ran up the tree, and from a point of safety chattered back savagely. This helped the cub's courage, and though the woodpecker he next encountered gave him a start, he proceeded confidently on his way. Such was his confidence that when a moose bird impudently hopped up to him, he reached out at it with a playful paw. The result was a sharp peck on the end of his nose that made him cower down and key. The noise he made was too much for the moose bird, who sought safety in flight. But the cub was learning. His misty little mind had already made an unconscious classification. There were live things and also not alive, and things not alive. Also, he must watch out for the live things. The things not alive remained always in one place. But the live things moved about, and there was no telling what they might do. The things to expect of them was the unexpected, and for this he must be prepared. He traveled very clumsily. He ran into sticks and things. A twig that he thought a long way off would the next instant hit him on the nose or rake along his ribs. There were inequalities of surface. Sometimes he overstepped and stubbed his nose. Quite as often he understepped and stubbed his feet. Then there were the pebbles and stones that turned under him when he trod upon them, and from them he came to know that the things not alive were not all in the same state of stable equilibrium, as well as was his cave. Also, that small things not alive were more liable than large things to fall down or turn over. But with every mishap he was learning. The longer he walked, the better he walked. He was adjusting himself. He was learning to calculate his own muscular movements, to know his physical limitations, to measure distances between objects, and between objects and himself. His was the luck of the beginner, born to be a hunter of meat. Though he did not know it, he plundered upon meat just outside his own cave door on his first foray into the world. It was by sheer blundering that he chanced upon the shrewdly hidden pteramidon nest. He fell into it. He had essayed to walk along the trunk of a fallen pine. The rotten bark gave way under his feet, and with a despairing yelp he pitched down the rounded descent, smashed through the leafage and stalks of a small bush, and in the heart of the bush on the ground fetched up in the midst of 7 pteramidon chicks. They made noise, and at first he was frightened at them. Then he perceived that they were very little, and he became bolder. They moved. He placed his paw on one, and its movements were accelerated. This was a source of enjoyment to him. He smelled it. He picked it up in his mouth. It struggled and tickled his tongue. At the same time, he was made aware of a sensation of hunger. His jaws closed together. There was a crunching of fragile bones, and warm blood ran in his mouth. The taste of it was good. This was meat, the same as his mother gave him, only it was all live between his teeth, and therefore better. So he ate the pteramidon, nor did he stop till he had devoured the whole brood. Then he licked his chops in quite the same way his mother did, and began to crawl out of the bush. He encountered a feathered whirlwind. He was confused and blinded by the rush of it, and the beat of angry wings. He hid his head between his paws and yelped. The blows increased. The mother pteramidon was in a fury. Then he became angry. He rose up, snarling, striking out with his paws. He sank his tiny teeth into one of the wings and pulled and tugged sturdily. The pteramidon struggled against him, showering blows upon him with her free wing. It was his first battle. He was elated. He forgot all about the unknown. He no longer was afraid of anything. He was fighting, tearing at a live thing that was striking at him. Also, this live thing was meat. The lust to kill was on him. He had just destroyed little live things. He would now destroy a big live thing. He was too busy and happy to know that he was happy. He was thrilling and exulting in new ways, new to him, and greater to him than any he had known before. He held on to the wing and growled between his tight clenched teeth. The pteramidon dragged him out of the bush. When she turned and tried to drag him back into the bush's shelter, he pulled her away from it and on into the open. And all the time she was making outcry and striking with her free wing. while feathers were flying like a snowfall. The pitch to which he was aroused was tremendous. All the fighting blood of his breed was up in him, and surging through him. This was living through, though he did not know it. He was realizing his own meaning in the world. He was doing that for which he was made, killing meat and battling to kill it. He was justifying his existence. Then, which life can do no greater, for life achieves its summit when it does to the uttermost that which it was equipped to do. After a time, the pterygomen ceased her struggling. He still held her by the wing, and they lay on the ground and looked at each other. He tried to growl threateningly, ferociously. She pecked on his nose, which by now, what of previous adventures, was sore. He winced, but held on. She pecked him again and again. From wincing, he went to whimpering. He tried to back away from her, oblivious to the fact that by his hold on her he dragged her after him. A rain of pecks fell on his ill-used nose. The flood of fight ebbed down in him, and releasing his prey, he turned tail and scampered off across the open in inglorious retreat. He lay down to rest on the other side of the open, near the edge of the bushes, his tongue lolling out, his chest heaving and panting, his nose still hurting him and causing him to continue his whimper. But as he lay there, suddenly there came to him a feeling as of something terrible impending. The unknown, with all its terrors, rushed upon him, and he shrank back instinctively into the shelter of the bush. As he did so, a draught of air fanned him, and a large winged body swept ominously and silently past. A hawk, driving down out of the blue, had barely missed him. While he lay in the bush, recovering from this fright and peering fearfully out, the mother pterygomen on the other side of the open space fluttered out of the ravaged nest. It was because of her loss that she paid no attention to the winged bolt of the sky, but the cub saw, and it was a warning and a lesson to him. The swift downward swoop of the hawk, the silent skim of its body, just above the ground, the strike of its talons in the body of the pterygomen. The pterygomen's squawk of agony and fright, and the hawk's rush upward into the blue, carrying the pterygomen away with it. It was a long time before the cub left his shelter. He had learned much. Live things were meat. They were good to eat. Also, live things, when they were large enough, could give hurt. It was better to eat small, live things like pterygomen chicks, and to let alone large live things like pterygomen hens. Nevertheless, he felt a little prick of ambition, a sneaking desire to have another battle with that pterygomen hen. Only the hawk had carried her away. Maybe there were other pterygomen hens. He would go and see. He came down a shelving bank to the stream. He had never seen water before. The footing looked good. There were no inequalities of surface. He stepped boldly out on it and went down, crying with fear into the embrace of the unknown. It was cold, and he gasped. Breathing quickly, the water rushed into his lungs, instead of the air that had always accompanied his act of breathing. The suffocation he experienced was like the pang of death. To him, it signified death. He had no conscious knowledge of death, but like every animal of the wild, he possessed the instinct of death. To him, it stood as the greatest of hurts. It was the very essence of the unknown. It was the sum of the terrors of the unknown. An unthinkable catastrophe that could happen to him, about which he knew nothing, and about which he feared everything. He came to the surface, and the sweet air rushed into his open mouth. He did not go down again, quite as though it had been a long-established custom of his. He struck out with all his legs and began to swim. The near bank was a yard away, but he had come up with his back to it, and the first thing his eyes rested upon was the opposite bank, towards which he immediately began to swim. The stream was a small one, but in the pool it widened out to a score of feet. Midway in the passage, and current picked up the cub and swept him downstream. He was caught in the miniature rapid at the bottom of the pool. There was little chance for swimming. The quiet water had become suddenly angry. Sometimes he was under, sometimes on top. At all times he was in violent motion, now being turned over or around, and again being smashed against a rock, and with every rock he struck he yelped. His progress was a series of yelps, from which might have been adduced the number of rocks he encountered. Below the rapid was a second pool, and here, captured by the eddy, he was gently borne to the bank, and as gently deposited on a bed of gravel. He crawled frantically clear of the water and lay down. He had learned some more about the world. Water was not alive, yet it moved. Also, it looked as solid as the earth, but was without any solidity at all. His conclusion was that things were not always what they appeared to be. The cub's fear of the unknown was an inherited distrust, and it had now been strengthened by experience. Thenceforth, in the nature of things, he would possess an abiding distrust of appearances. He would have to learn the reality of a thing before he could put his faith into it. One other adventure was destined for him that day. He recollected that there was such a thing in the world as his mother, and then there came to him a feeling that he wanted her more than all the rest of the things in the world. Not only was his body tired with the adventures and had undergone, but his little brain was equally tired. In all the days he had lived, it had not worked so hard as on this one day. Furthermore, he was sleeping, so he started out to look for the cave and his mother, feeling at the same time an overwhelming rush of loneliness and helplessness. He was sprawling along between some bushes when he heard a sharp, intimidating cry. There was a flash of yellow before his eyes. He saw the weasel weeping swiftly away from him. It was a small, live thing, and he had no fear. Then before him at his feet he saw an extremely small live thing, only several inches long, a young weasel that, like himself, had disobediently gone out adventuring. It tried to retreat before him. He turned it over with his paw. It made a strange grating noise. The next moment the flash of yellow reappeared before his eyes. He heard the intimidating cry, and at the same instant received a severe blow on the side of the neck, and felt the sharp teeth of the mother weasel cut into his flesh. While he yelped and keyed and scrambled back, he saw the mother weasel leap upon her young one and disappear. With it into the neighboring thicket. The cut of her teeth in his neck still hurt, but his feelings were hurt more grievously, and he sat down and weakly whimpered. This mother weasel was so small and so savage. He was yet to learn that for size and weight the weasel was the most ferocious, vindictive,
and terrible of all the killers of the wild. But a portion of this knowledge was quickly to be his. He was still whimpering when the mother weasel reappeared. She did not rush him now that her young one was safe. She approached more cautiously, and the cub had full opportunity to observe her lean, snake-like body, and her head erect, eager, and snake-like itself. Her sharp, menacing cry sent the hair bristling along his back, and he snarled warningly at her. She came closer and closer. There was a leap swifter than his unpracticed sight, and the lean, yellow body disappeared for a moment out of the field of his vision. The next moment she was at his throat, her teeth buried in his hair and flesh. At first he snarled and tried to fight, but he was very young, and this was only his first day in the world, and his snarl became a whimper, his fight a struggle to escape. The weasel never relaxed her hold. She hung on, striving to press down with her teeth to the great vein where his lifeblood bubbled. The weasel was a drinker of blood, and it was ever her preference to drink from the throat of life itself. The gray cub would have died, and there would have been no story to write about, had not the she-wolf come bounding through the bushes. The weasel let go of the cub and flashed at the she-wolf's throat, missing, but getting a hold on the jaw instead. The she-wolf flirted her head like the snap of a whip, breaking the weasel's hold and flinging it high in the air. And still in the air, the she-wolf's jaws closed on the lean, yellow body, and the weasel knew death between the crunching teeth. The cub experienced another excess of affection on the part of his mother. Her joy at finding him seemed greater even than his joy at being found. She nuzzled him and caressed him, and licked the cuts made in him by the weasel's teeth. Then between them, mother and cub, they ate the blood drinker, and after that went back to the cave and slept. Chapter break. Chapter 5. The Law of Meat. The cub's development was rapid. He rested for 2 days, then ventured forth from the cave again. It was on this adventure that he found the young weasel whose mother he had helped eat, and he saw to it that the young weasel went the way of its mother. But on this trip he did not get lost. When he grew tired, he found his way back to the cave and slept. And every day thereafter found him out and arranging a wider area. He began to get accurate measurement of his strength and his weakness, and to know when to be bold and when to be cautious. He found it expedient to be cautious all the time, except for the rare moments when assured of his own intrepidity, he abandoned himself to petty rages and lust. He was always a little demon of fury. When he chanced upon a stray pteranodon, never did he fail to respond savagely to the chatter of the squirrel he had first met on the blasted pine, while the sight of a moose bird almost invariably put him into the wildest of rages, for he never forgot the peck on the nose he had received from the first of that ilk he encountered. But there were times when even a moose bird failed to affect him, and those were times when he felt himself to be in danger from some other prowling meat-eater. He never forgot the hawk, and its moving shadow always sent him crouching into the nearest thicket. He no longer sprawled and straddled, and already he was developing the gait of his mother, slinking and furtive, apparently without exertion, yet sliding along with a swiftness that was as deceptive as it was imperceptible. In the matter of meat, his luck had been all in the beginning. The 7 pteranodon chicks and the baby weasel represented the sum of his killings. His desire to kill strengthened with the days, and he cherished hungry ambition for the squirrel that chattered too volubly and always informed all wild creatures that the wolf cub was approaching, but as birds flew in the air, squirrels could climb trees, and the cub could only try to crawl unobserved upon the squirrel when it was on the ground. The cub entertained a great respect for his mother. She could get meat, and she never failed to bring him his share. Further, she was unafraid of things. It did not occur to him that this fearlessness was founded upon experience and knowledge. Its effect on him was that of an impression of power. His mother represented power, and as he grew older, he felt this power in the sharper admonishment of her paw, while the reproving nudge of her nose gave place for the slash of her fangs. For this, likewise, he respected his mother. She compelled obedience from him, and the older he grew, the shorter grew her temper. Famine came again, and the cub, with clearer consciousness, knew once more the bite of hunger. The she-wolf ran herself thin in the quest for meat. She rarely slept any more in the cave, spending most of her time on the meat trail and spending it vainly. This famine was not a long one, but it was a severe while it lasted. The cub found no more milk in his mother's breast, nor did he get one mouthful of meat for himself. Before he had hunted in play for the sheer joyousness of it. Now he hunted in deadly earnestness, and found nothing, yet the failure of it accelerated his development. He studied the habit of the squirrel with greater carefulness, and strove with greater craft to steal upon it and surprise it. He studied the wood mice and tried to dig them out of their burrows, and he learned much about the ways of moose birds and woodpeckers. And there came a day when the hawk's shadow did not drive him crouching into the bushes. He had grown stronger and wiser and more confident. Also, he was desperate, so he sat on his haunches conspicuously in an open space and challenged the hawk down out of the sky, for he knew that there, floating in the blue above him, was meat, the meat his stomach yearned after so insistently. But the hawk refused to come down and give battle, and the cub crawled away into a thicket and whimpered his disappointment and hunger. The famine broke. The she-wolf brought home meat. It was strange meat, different from any she had ever brought before. It was a lynx kitten, partly grown like the cub, but not so large, and it was all for him. His mother had satisfied her hunger elsewhere, though he did not know that it was the rest of the lynx litter that had gone to satisfy her. Nor did he know the desperateness of her deed. He knew only that the velvet-furred kitten was meat, and he ate and waxed happier with every mouthful. A full stomach conduces to inaction, and the cub lay in the cave. Sleeping against his mother's side, he was aroused by her snarling. Never had he heard her snarl so terribly. Possibly in her whole life it was the most terrible snarl she ever gave. There was reason for it, and none knew it better than she. A lynx's lair is not despoiled with impunity. In the full glare of the afternoon light, crouching in the entrance of the cave, the cub saw the lynx mother. The hair ripped up along his back at the sight. Here was fear, and it did not require his instinct to tell him of it. And if sight alone were not sufficient, the cry of rage the intruder gave, beginning with a snarl and rushing abruptly upward into a hoarse screech, was convincing enough in itself. The cub felt the prod of the life that was in him, and stood up and snarled valiantly by his mother's side. But she thrust him ignominiously away, and behind her became because of the low-roofed entrance the lynx could not leap in, and when she made a crawling rush of it, the she-wolf sprang upon her and pinned her down. The cub saw little of the battle. There was a tremendous snarling and spitting and screeching. The two animals threshed about, the lynx ripping and tearing with her claws and using her teeth as well, while the she-wolf used her teeth alone. Once the cub sprang in and sank his teeth into the hind leg of the lynx. He clung on, growling savagely. Though he did not know it by the weight of his body, he clogged the action of the leg, and thereby saved his mother much damage. A change in the battle crushed him under both their bodies, and wrenched loose his hold. The next moment the two mothers separated, and before they rushed together again, the lynx lashed out at the cub with a huge forepaw that ripped his shoulder open to the bone, and sent him hurtling sideways against the wall. Then was added to the uproar the cub's shrill yelp of pain and fright, but the fight lasted so long that he had time to cry himself out and to experience a second burst of courage, and the end of the battle found him again clinging to a hind leg and furiously growling between his teeth. The lynx was dead, but the she-wolf was very weak and sick. At first she caressed the cub and licked his wounded shoulder, but the blood she had lost had taken with it her strength, and for all of a day and a night she lay by her dead foe's side, without movement. Scarcely breathing for a week, she never left the cave, except for water, and then her was movements were slow and painful. At the end of that time, the lynx was devoured, while the she-wolf's wounds had healed sufficiently to permit her to take the meat trail again. The cub's shoulder was stiff and sore, and for some time he limped from the terrible slash he had received. But the world now seemed changed. He went about in it with greater confidence, with a feeling of prowess that had not been his in the days before. The battle with the lynx he had looked upon life in a more ferocious aspect. He had fought, he had buried his teeth in the flesh of the foe, and he had survived, and because of all this, he carried himself more boldly with a touch of defiance that was new in him. He was no longer afraid of minor things, and much of his timidity and vanished, though the unknown never ceased to press upon him with its mysterious and terrors, intangibly and ever menacingly. And ever menacing. He began to accompany his mother on the meat trap, and he saw much of the killing of meat, and began to play his part in it. And in his own dim way he learned the law of meat. There were two kinds of life, his own kind and the other kind. His own kind included his mother and himself. The other kind included all life things that moved, but the other kind was divided. One portion was what his own kind killed and ate. This portion was composed of the non-killers and the small killers. The other portion killed and ate his own kind, or was killed and eaten by his own kind. And out of this classification arose the law. The aim of life was meat. Life itself was meat. Life lived on life. There were the eaters and eaten. The law was eat or be eaten. He did not formulate the law in clear, set terms and moralize about it. He did not even think the law, he merely lived the law without thinking about it at all. He saw the law operating around him at every sight. He had eaten the pteramidon chicks, the hawk had eaten the pteramidon mother. The hawk would also have eaten him later, when he had grown more formidable. He wanted to eat the hawk. He had eaten the lynx kitten. Lynx mother would have eaten him had she not herself been killed and eaten. And so it went. The law was being lived about him by all live things. And he himself was part and parcel of the law. He was a killer. His only food was meat, live meat, that ran away swiftly before him, or flew into the air, or climbed trees, or hid in the ground, or faced him and fought with him, or turned the tables and ran after him. Had the cub thought in man fashion, he might have epitomized life as a voracious appetite, and the world as a place wherein ranged a multitude of appetites, pursuing and being pursued, hunting and being hunted, eating and being eaten, all in blindness and confusion, with violence and disorder, a chaos of gluttony and slaughter, rolled over by chance, merciless, planless, endless. But the cub did not think in man fashion. He did not look at things with wide vision. He was single-purposed and entertained but one thought of desire at a time. Besides the law of meat, there were a myriad other and lesser laws for him to learn and obey. The world was filled with surprise, the stir of the life that was in him, the play of his muscles was an unending happiness. To run down meat was to experience thrills and elations. His rages and battles were pleasures. Terror itself and the mystery of the unknown led to his living, and there were easements and satisfactions to have a full stomach, to doze lazily in the sunshine. Such things were remu- remunerations in full for his ardors and toils. While his ardors and light toil and toils were in themselves self-remunerative, self-remunerative, they were expressions of life, and life is always happy when it is expressing itself. So this cub had no quarrel with his hostile environment. He was very much alive, very happy, and very proud of himself. Part 3. Chapter Break. Don't worry, this will be a little bit shorter. We're just going to have some water. All right. Chapter 1. The Makers of Fire. The cub came upon it suddenly. It was his own fault. He had been careless. He had left the cave and run down to the stream to drink. It might have been that he took no notice because he was heavy with sleep. He had been out all night on the meat trail and had but just then awakened, and his carelessness might have been due to the familiarity of the trail to the pool. He had traveled it often, and nothing had ever happened on it. He went down past the blasted pine, crossed the open space, and trotted in amongst the trees. Then, at the same instant, he saw and smelt before him, sitting silently on their haunches, were five live things, the like of which he had never seen before. It was his first glimpse of mankind. But at the sight of him, the five men did not spring to their feet, nor show their teeth, nor snarl. They did not move, but sat there silent and ominous. Nor did the cub move. Every instinct of his nature would have impelled him to dash wildly away. Had there not suddenly and for the first time arisen in him another and counter instinct, a great awe descended upon him. He was beaten down to movelessness by an overwhelming sense of his own weakness and littleness. Here was mastery and power something far and away beyond him. The cub had never seen man, yet the instinct concerning man was his. In dim ways he recognized in the man an animal, in, in man the animal that had fought itself to primacy over the other animals of the wild. Not alone out of his eyes, not alone out of his own eyes, but out of the eyes of all his ancestors was the cub now looking upon man. Out of eyes that had circled in the darkness around countless winter campfires, that had peered from safe distances and fought from the hearts of thickets at the strange two-legged animal that was lord over living things. The spell of the cub's heritage was upon him, the fear and the respect born of the centuries of struggle, and the accumulated experience of the generations. The heritage was too compelling for a wolf that was only a cub. Had he been full grown, he would have run away. But, but it was As it was, he cowered down in a paralysis of fear, already half proffering the submission that his kind had proffered from the first wolf's first time a wolf came in to sit by man's fire and be made warm. One of the Indians arose and walked over to him and stooped above him. The cub cowered closer to the ground. It was the unknown objectified at last. In concrete flesh and blood, bending over him and reaching down to seize hold of him. His hair bristled involuntarily. His lips writhed back, and his little fangs were bared. The hand poised like doom above him hesitated, and the man spoke, laughing. Look, the white fangs. The other Indians laughed loudly, and urged the man on to pick up the cub. As the hand descended closer and closer, there raged within the cub a battle of the instincts. He experienced two great impulsions: to yield, and to fight. The resulting action was a compromise. He did both. He yielded till the hand almost touched him, then he fought, his teeth flashing in a snap that sank them into the hand. The next moment he received a clout alongside, the head that knocked him over on his side. Then all fight fled out of him. His puppyhood and the instinct of submission took charge of him. He sat up on his haunches and keyed, but the man whose hand he had bitten was angry. The cub received a clout on the other side of his head, whereupon he sat up and keyed louder than ever. The four Indians laughed more loudly, while even the man who had been bitten began to laugh. They surrounded the cub and laughed at him, while he wailed out his terror and his hurt. In the midst of it, he heard something. The Indians heard it too, but the cub knew what it was, and with a last long wail that had in it more of triumph than grief, he ceased his noise and waited for the coming of his mother, of his ferocious and indomitable mother, who fought and killed all things, and was never afraid. She was snarling as she ran. She heard the cry of her cub and was dashing to save him. She bounded in amongst them, her anxious and militant motherhood making her anything but a pretty sight. But to the cub, the spectacle of her protective rage was pleasing. He uttered a glad little cry and bounded to meet her, while the man animals went back hastily several steps. The she-wolf stood over against her, cub facing the men, with bristling hair, a snarl rumbling deep in her throat. Her face was distorted and malignant with menace, even the bridge of the nose wrinkling from tip to eyes. So prodigious was her snarl. Then it was that a cry went up from one of the men. Gishi! Was what he uttered. It was an exclamation of surprise. The cub felt his mother wilting at the sound. Kishi! The man cried again, this time with sharpness and authority. And then the cub saw his mother, the she-wolf, the fearless one, crouching down till her belly touched the ground, whimpering, wagging her tail, making peace signs. The cub could not understand. He was appalled. The awe of man rushed over him again. His instinct had been true. His mother verified it. She, too, rendered submission to the man-animals. The man who had spoken came over to her. He put his hand over upon her head, and she only crouched closer. She did not snap, nor threaten to snap. The other men came up and surrounded her, and felt her and pawed her, which action which actions made no, she made no attempt to resent. They were greatly excited, and made many noises with their vehemence. These noises were not indications of danger. The cub decided, as he crouched near his mother, still bristling from time to time, but doing his best to submit. It is not strange. Uh, an Indian was saying, "Her father was a wolf. It is true. Her mother was a dog. But did not my brother tie her out in the woods all of 3 nights in the mating season? Therefore was the father of Kishe wolf. It is it is a year, Greybeaver, since she ran away," spoke a second Indian. "It is not strange, Salmon Tongue," Greybeaver answered. "It was the time of the famine, and there was no meat for the dogs. She lived with the wolves," said a third Indian. "So it would seem. 3 eagles," Greybeaver answered, laying his hand on the cub. "And this be the sign of it." The cub snarled a little at the touch of the hand, and the hand flew back to administer a clout, whereupon the cub covered its fangs, and sank down submissively, while the hand, returning, rubbed behind his ears, and up and down his back. "This be the sign of it." Greybeaver went on. "It is plain that his mother is Kishe, but his father was a wolf. Wherefore is there in him little dog and much wolf. His fangs be white, and white fangs shall be his name. White fangs shall be his name. I have spoken. He is my dog, for was not Kishe my brother's dog, and is not my brother dead?" The cub, who had thus received a name in the world, lay and watched for a time. The man-animals continued to make their mouth noises. Then Greybeaver took a knife from a sheath that hung around his neck and went into the thicket and cut a stick. White Fang watched him. He notched the stick at each end, and in the notches fastened strings of rawhide. One string he tied around the throat of Kishe. Then he led her to a small pine, among which he tied the other string. White Fang followed and lay down beside her. Salmon Tongue's hand reached out to him and rolled him over on his back. Kishe looked on anxiously. White Fang felt fear mounting in him again. He could not quite suppress a snarl, but he made no offer to snap. The hand, with fingers crooked and spread apart, rubbed his stomach in a playful way and rolled him from side to side. It was ridiculous and ungainly, lying there on his back, with legs sprawling in the air. Besides, it was a position of such utter helplessness that White Fang's whole nature revolted against it. He could do nothing to defend himself if this man-animal intended harm. White Fang knew that he could not escape it. How could he spring away with his 4 legs in the air above him? Yet submission made him master his fear, and he only growled softly. This growl he could not suppress, nor did the man-animal resent it by giving him a blow on the head. And furthermore, such was the strangeness of it, White Fang experienced an unaccountable sensation of pleasure as the hand rubbed back and forth. When he was rolled on his side, he ceased to growl. When the fingers pressed and prodded at the base of his ears, the pleasurable sensations increased. And when with a final rub and scratch the man left him alone and went away, all fear had died out of the white Fang. He was to know fear many times in his dealings with man, yet it was a token of the fearless companionship with man that was ultimately to be his. After a time, White Fang heard strange noises approaching. He was quick in his classification, for he knew them at once for man-animal noises. A few minutes later, the remainder of the tribe, strung out as it was on the march, trailed in. There were more men and many women and children, 40 souls of them, and all happily burdened with camp equipage and outfits. Also, there were many dogs, and these, with the exception of the pot-grown puppies, were likewise burdened with camp outfits on their backs, in bags that fastened tightly around underneath. The dogs carried from 20 to 30 pounds of weight. White Fang had never seen dogs before, but at sight of them he felt that they were his own kind, only somehow different. But they displayed little difference from the wolf when they discovered the cub and his mother. There was a rush. White Fang bristled and snarled and snapped in the face of the open-mouthed oncoming wave of dogs, and went down and under them, feeling the sharp slash of teeth in his body, himself biting and tearing at the legs and bellies above. There was a great uproar. He could hear the snarl of Kishe as she fought for him, and he could hear the cries of the man-animals, the sound of clubs striking upon bodies, and the yelps of pain from the dogs he struck. Only a few seconds elapsed before he was on his feet again. He could now see the man-animals driving back the dogs with clubs and stones, defending him, saving him from the savage teeth of his kind that somehow was not his kind. And though there was no reason in his brain for a clear conception of so abstract a thing as justice, nevertheless, in his own way, he felt the justice of the man-animals, and he knew them for what they were, makers of law and executors of law. Also, he approached the power with which they administered the law. Unlike any animals he had ever encountered, they did not bite nor claw. They enforced their live strength with the power of dead things. Dead things did their bidding. Thus sticks and stones, directed by these strange creatures, leaped through the air like living things, inflicting grievous hurts upon the dogs. To his mind, this was power unusual, power inconceivable, and beyond the natural power that was godlike. White Fang, in the very nature of him, could never know anything of gods. At the best, he could know only things that were beyond knowing. But the wonder and awe that he had of these man-animals in ways resembled what would be the wonder and awe of man at sight of some celestial creature on a mountain top hurling thunderbolts from either hand at an astonished world. The last dog had been driven back. The hubbub died down, and White Fang licked his hurts and meditated upon this his first taste of pack cruelty and his introduction to the pack. He had never dreamed that his own kind consisted of more than one eye, his mother, and himself. They had constituted a kind apart, and here, abruptly, he had discovered many more creatures apparently of his own kind, and there was a subconscious resentment that these his kind at first sight had pitched upon him and tried to destroy him in the same way he resented his mother being tied with a stick, even though it was done by the superior man animals. It savored of the trap of bondage, yet of the trap and of bondage he knew nothing. Freedom to roam and run and lie down at will had been his heritage, and here it was being infringed upon. His mother's movements were restricted to the length of a stick, and by the length of that same stick was he restricted, for he had not yet got beyond the need of his mother's side. One moment. He did not like it, nor did he like it when the man animals rose and went on with their march, for a tiny man animal took the other end of the stick and led Quiche captive behind him. And behind Quiche followed White Fang, greatly perturbed and worried by this new adventure he had entered upon. They went down for valley of the stream, far beyond White Fang's wildest ranging, until they came to the end of the valley, where the stream ran into the Mackenzie River. Here, where canoes were cast on poles high in the air, and where stood fish racks for the drying of fish, camp was made, and White Fang looked on with wondering eyes. The superiority of these man animals increased with every moment. There was their mastery over all these sharp fanged dogs. It breached a breed of power, but greater than that to the wolf cub was their mastery over things not alive. The capacity to communicate motion to unmoving things, the capacity to change the very face of the world. It was this last that especially affected him. The elevation of frames of pools caught his eye. Yet this in itself was not so remarkable, being done by the same creatures that flung sticks and stones to great distances. But when the frames of poles were made into teepees by being covered with cloth and skins, White Fang was astounded. It was the colossal bulk of them that impressed him. They arose around him on every side, like some monstrous, quick-growing form of life. They occupied nearly the whole circumference of his field of vision. He was afraid of them. They loomed ominously above him, and when the breeze stirred them into huge movements, he cowered down in fear, keeping his eyes warily upon them, and prepared to spring away if they attempted to precipitate themselves upon him. But in a short while his fear of the teepees passed away. He saw the women and children passing in and out of them without harm, and he saw the dogs trying often to get into them, and being driven away with sharp words and flying stones. After a time he left Quiche's side and crawled cautiously towards the wall of the nearest teepee. It was the curiosity of growth that urged him on, the necessity of learning and living and doing that brings experience. The last few inches to the wall of the teepee were crawled with painful slowness and precaution. The day's events had prepared him for the unknown to manifest itself in most stupendous and unthinkable ways. At last his nose touched the canvas. He waited, nothing happened. Then he smelled the strange fabric, saturation with a man's smell. He closed on the canvas with his teeth and gave a gentle tug. Nothing happened, though the adjacent portions of the teepee moved. He tugged harder. There was a greater movement. It was delightful. He tugged still harder and repeatedly until the whole teepee was in motion. Then the sharp cry of a squall inside sent him scampering back to Quiche. But after that he was afraid no more of the looming bulks of the teepees. A moment later he was straying away again from his mother. Her stick was tied to a peg in the ground, and she could not follow him. A part-grown puppy, somewhat larger and older than he, came toward him slowly with ostentatious and belligerent importance. The puppy's name, as White Fang was afterward to hear him called, was Lip Lip. He had experience in puppy fights and was already something of a bully. Lip Lip was White Fang's own kind, and being only a puppy did not seem dangerous. So White Fang prepared to meet him in friendly spirit, but when the stranger's walk became stiff-legged and his lips lifted clear of his teeth, White Fang stiffened too, and answered with lift lips. They half circled about each other, tentatively snarling and bristling. This lasted several minutes, and White Fang was beginning to enjoy it, as a sort of game, but suddenly, with remarkable swiftness, Lip Lip leaped in, delivering a slashing snap, and leaped away again. The snap had taken the effect on the shoulder that had been hurt by the lynx, and that was still sore deep down near the bone. The surprise and hurt of it brought a yelp out of White Fang, but the next moment, in a rush of anger, he was upon Lip Lip and snapping viciously. But Lip Lip had lived his life in camp and had fought many puppy fights. 3 times, 4 times, and half a dozen times, his sharp little teeth scored on the newcomer, until White Fang, yelping shamelessly, led to the protection of his mother. It was the first of the many fights he was to have with Lip Lip, for they were enemies from this start, born so, with natures destined perpetually to clash. Quiche licked White Fang soothingly with her tongue and tried to prevail upon him to remain with her, to remain to remain with her. But his curiosity was rampant, and several minutes later he was venturing forth on a new quest. He came upon one of the man animal's gray beaver, who was squatting on his hams and doing something with sticks and dry moss spread before him on the ground. White Fang came near to him and watched Gray Beaver make mouth noises, which White Fang interpreted as not hostile, so he came still nearer. Women and children were carrying more sticks and branches to Gray Beaver. It was evidently an affair of moment. White Fang came in until he touched Gray Beaver's knee. So curious was he, and already forgetful that this was a terrible man-animal. Suddenly he saw a strange thing like mist beginning to arise from the sticks and moss beneath Gray Beaver's hands. Then amongst the sticks themselves appeared a live thing, twisting and turning of the color like the color of the sun in the sky. White Fang knew nothing about fire. It drew him as the light in the mouth of the cave had drawn him in his early puppyhood. He crawled the several steps towards the flame. He heard Grey Beaver chuckle above him, and he knew the sound was not hostile. Then his nose touched the flame, and at the same instant his little tongue went out to it. For a moment he was paralyzed. The unknown, lurking in the midst of the sticks and moss, was savagely clutching him by the nose. He scrambled backwards, bursting out in astonishment. Explosion of keys at the sound. Quiche leaped, snarling, to the end of her stick, and there raged terribly because she knew she could not come to his aid. But Grey Beaver laughed loudly and slapped his thighs and told the happenings to all the rest of the camp, till everybody was laughing uproariously. But White Fang sat on his haunches, and keyed, a forlorn and pitiable little figure in the midst of the man animals. It was the worst hurt he had ever known, Both nose and tongue had been scorched by the live thing, sun-colored, that had grown up under Grey Beaver's hands. He cried and cried interminably, and every flesh wail was greeted by a burst of laughter on the part of the man animals. He tried to soothe his nose with his tongue, but the tongue was burnt too, and the two hurts coming together produced greater hurt. Whereupon he cried more helplessly and helplessly than ever. And then shame came to him. He knew laughter and the meaning of it. It is not given us to know how some animals know laughter, and know when they are being laughed at, but it was the same way. That White Fang knew it, and he felt shame that the man animals should be laughing at him. He turned and fled away, not from the hurt of the fire, but from the laughter that sunk even deeper, and hurt in the spirit of him. And he fled to Quiche, raging at the end of her stick like an animal gone mad. To Quiche, the one creature in the world who was not laughing at him. Twilight drew near, twilight drew down, and night came on. And White Fang lay by his mother's side. His nose and tongue were hurt, but he was perplexed by a greater trouble. He was homesick. He felt a vacancy in him, a need for the hush and quietude of the stream and the cave and the cliff. Life had become too populous. There were so many of the man animals, men, women, and children, all making noises and irritations, and there were the dogs ever squabbling and bickering, bursting into uproars, and creating confusions. The restful loneliness and the only life he had known was gone. Here the very air was palpitant with life. It hummed and buzzed unceasingly, continually changing its intensity, and abruptly variant in pitch. It impinged on his nerves and senses, made him nervous and restless, and worried him with a perpetual imminence of happening. He watched the man animal coming and going and moving about the camp in fashion distantly resembling the way men look upon the gods they create. So looked White Fang upon the man animals before him. They were superior creatures of a verity gods. To his dim comprehension, they were as much wonder workers as gods are to men. They were creatures of mastery, possessing all manner of unknown and impossible potencies, overlords of the alive and the not alive, making obey that which moved, imparting movement to that which did not move, and making life sun-colored, and biting life to grow out of dead moss and wood. They were fire makers. They were gods. Chapter break. Chapter 2. The Bondage. The days were thronged with experience for White Fang. During the time that Quiche was tied by the stick, he ran about over all the camp, inquiring, investigating, learning. He quickly came to know much of the ways of the man animals, but familiarity did not breed contempt. The more he came to know them, the more they vindicated their superiority, the more they displayed their mysterious powers, the greater loomed their godlikeness. To man has been given the grief often of seeing his gods overthrown and his altars crumbling, but to the wolf and the wild dog that have come in to crouch at man's feet, unlike man, whose gods are of the unseen, and the overguessed vapors and mist of fancy alluding and garmenture of reality, wandering wraiths of desired goodness and power, intangible outcroppings of self into this realm of spirit, unlike man, the wolf, and the wild dog, that have come into the fire find their gods in the living flesh, solid to the touch, occupying earth space, and requiring time for the accomplishments of their ends and their existence. No effort of faith is necessary to believe in such a God. No effort of will can possibly induce disbelief in such a God. There is no getting away from it. There it stands on its two hind legs, club in hand, immensely potential, passionate and wrathful, and loving, God and mystery, and power all wrapped up and round by flesh that bleeds when it is torn, and that is good to eat like any flesh. And so it was with White Fang, the man animals were gods, unmistakable and unescapable. As his mother Quiche had rendered her allegiance to them at the first cry of her name, so he was beginning to render his allegiance. He gave them the trail of as a privilege, indubitably theirs. When they walked, he got out of their way. When they called, he came. When they threatened, he cowered down. When they commanded him to go, he went away hurriedly, for behind any wish of theirs was power to enforce that wish, power that hurt, power that expressed itself in clouts and clubs, in flying stones and singing lashes of whips. He belonged to them as all dogs belong to them. His actions were theirs to command. His body was theirs to maul, to stamp out, to stamp upon, to tolerate. Such was the lesson that was quickly borne in upon him. It came hard, no, going as it did counter to much that was strong and dominant in his own nature, and while he disliked it in the learning of it, unknown to him, he was learning to like it. It was a placing of his destiny in another's hands, a shifting of the responsibilities of existence. This in itself was compensation, for it is always easier to lead upon another than to stand alone. But it did not all happen in a day. This giving over of himself, body and soul, to the man animals, he could not immediately forego his wild heritage and his memories of the wild. There were days when he crept to the edge of the forest and stood and listened to something calling him far and away, and always he returned, restless and uncomfortable, to whimper softly and wistfully at Quiche's side, and to lick her face with eager, questioning tongue. White Fang learned rapidly the ways of the camp. He knew the injustice and greediness of the older dogs when meat or fish was thrown out to be eaten. He came to know that men were more just children, more cruel, and women more kindly and more likely to toss him a bit of meat or bone. And after 2 or 3 painful adventures with the mothers of pot-grown puppies, he came into the knowledge that it was always good policy to let such mothers alone, to keep away from them as far as possible, to avoid them when he saw them coming. But the bane of his life was Lip Lip. Larger, older, and stronger, Lip Lip had selected White Fang for his special object of persecution. White Fang fought willingly enough, but he was outclassed. His enemy was too big. Lip Lip became a nightmare to him. Whenever he ventured away from his mother, the bully was sure to appear, trailing at his heels, snarling at him, picking upon him, and watchful of an opportunity when no man animal was near to spring upon him and force a fight. As Lip Lip invariably won, he enjoyed it hugely. It became his chief delight in life, as it became White Fang's chief torment. But the effect upon White Fang was not to cow him. Though he suffered most of the damage and was always defeated, his spirit remained unsubdued. Yet a bad effect was produced. He became malignant and morose. His temper had been savage by birth, but it became more savage under this unending persecution. The genial, playful, puppyish side of him found little expression. He never played and gamboled about with the other puppies of the camp. Lip Lip would not permit it. The moment White Fang appeared near them, Lip Lip was upon him, bullying and hectoring him, or fighting with him, until he had driven him away. The effect of all this was to rob White Fang of much of his puppyhood, to make him, in his comportment, older than his age. Denied the outlet through play of his energies, he recoiled upon himself. He developed his mental processes. He became cunning. He had idle time in which to devote himself to thoughts of trickery, prevented from obtaining his share of meat and fish when a general feed was given to the camp dogs. He became a clever thief. He had to forage for himself, and he foraged well, though he was of he was oft times a plague to the squaws in consequence. He learned to sneak about camp, to be crafty, to know what was going on everywhere, to see and to hear everything and to reason accordingly, and successfully to devise ways and means of avoiding his impeccable persecutor. It was early in the day of his persecution that he played his first really big crafty game, and got therefrom his first taste of revenge. As Quiche, when with the wolves, had lured out to destruction dogs from the cramps of men, so White Fang, in manner somewhat similar, lured Lip Lip into Quiche's avenging jaws. Retreating before Lip Lip, White Fang made an indirect flight that led in and out and around various teepees of the camp. He was a good runner, swifter than any puppy of his size, and swifter than Lip Lip. But he did not run his best in this chase. He barely held his own. One leap ahead of his pursuer, Lip Lip, excited by the chase and by the persistent nearness of his victim, forgot caution and locality. When he remembered locality, it was too late. Dashing at top speed around a teepee, he ran full tilt into Quiche, lying at the end of her stick. He gave one yelp of consternation, and then her punishing jaws closed upon him. She was tied, but he could not get away from her easily. She rolled him off his legs so that he could not run, while she repeatedly ripped and slashed him with her fangs. When at last he succeeded in rolling clear of her, he crawled to his feet, badly disheveled, hurt both in body and in spirit. His hair was standing out all over him in tufts, where her teeth had mauled. He stood where he had risen, opened his mouth, and broke out the long, heartbroken puppy wail. But even this he was not allowed to complete. In the middle of it, White Fang, rushing in, sank his teeth into Lip Lip's hind leg. There was no fight left in Lip Lip, and he ran away shamelessly, his victim hot on his heels, and worrying him all the way back to his teepee. But the squaws came to his aid, and White Fang, transformed into a raging demon, was finally driven off only by fusillade of stones. Came the day when Greybeaver decided that the liability of her running away was past, released Quiche. White Fang was delighted with his mother's freedom. He accompanied her joyfully about the camp, and so long as he remained close by her side, Lip Lip kept a respectful distance. White Fang even bristled up to him and walked stiff-legged, but Lip Lip ignored the challenge. He was no fool himself, and whatever vengeance he decided to wreak, he could wait until he caught White Fang alone. Later on that day, Quiche and White Fang strayed into the edge of the woods, next to the camp. He led his mother there step by step, and now when she stopped, he tried to inveigle her further. The stream, the lair, and the quiet woods were calling to him, and he wanted her to come. He ran on a few steps, stopped, and looked back. She had not moved. He whined pleadingly and scurried playfully in and out of the underbrush. He ran back to her, licked her face, and ran on again, and still she did not move. He stopped and regarded her, all of an intentness and eagerness physically expressed that slowly faded out of him as she turned her head and gazed back at the camp. There was something calling to him out there in the open. His mother heard it too, but she heard also that other and louder call, the call of the fire and of man, the call that has been given alone to of all animals to the wolf to answer, to the wolf and the wild dog, who are brothers. Quiche turned and slowly trotted back toward camp. Stronger than the physical restraint of the stick was the clutch of the camp upon her. Unseen and occulty, the gods still gripped with their power and would not let her go. White Fang sat down in the shadow of a birch and whimpered softly. There was a strong smell of pine, and subtle wood fragrances filled the air, reminding him of his old life of freedom, before the days of his bondage. But he was still only a part-grown puppy, and stronger than the call either of men or of the wild was the call of his mother. All the hours of his short life he had depended upon her. The time was yet to come for independence. So he arose and trotted forlornly back and to camp, pausing once and twice to sit down and whimper and to listen to the call that still sounded in the depths of the forest. In the wild, the time of a mother with her young and short, but under the dominion of man, it is sometimes even short. Thus it was with White Fang. Beaver was in the depth of Three Eagles. Three Eagles was going away on a trip up the Mackenzie to the Great Slave Lake. A strip of scarlet cloth, a bearskin, 20 cartridges, and Quiche went to pay the debt. White Fang saw his mother taken aboard Three Eagles' canoe and tried to follow her. A blow from the Three Eagles knocked him backwards to the land. The canoe shoved off. He sprang into the water and swam after it, deaf to the sharp cries of Grey Beaver to return. Even a man-animal, a god, White Fang ignored. Such was the terror he was in of losing his mother. But gods are accustomed to being obeyed, and Grey Beaver wrathfully launched a canoe in pursuit. When he overtook White Fang, he reached down and by the nape of the neck lifted him clear of the water. He did not deposit him at once in the whole bottom of the canoe. Holding him suspended with one hand, with the other hand he proceeded to give him a beating. It was a beating. His hand was heavy, every blow was shrewd to hurt, and he delivered a multitude of blows. Impelled by the blows that rained upon him, now from this side, now from that, White Fang swung back and forth like an erratic and jerky pendulum. Varying were the emotions that surged through him. At first he had known surprise. Then came a momentary fear, when he yelped several times to the impact of the hand. But this was quickly followed by anger. His free nature asserted itself, and he showed his teeth and snarled fearlessly in the face of the wrathful god. This was served to make the god more wrathful. The blows came faster, heavier, and more shrewd to hurt. Grey Beaver continued to beat White Fang, continued to snarl, but this could not last forever. One or the other must give over, and that one was White Fang. Fear surged through him again. For the first time he was being really manhandled. The occasional blows of sticks and stones he had previously experienced were as caresses compared with this. He broke down and began to cry and yelp. For a time each blow brought a yelp from him. But fear passed into terror, until finally his yelps were voiced in unbroken succession, unconnected with the rhythm of the punishment. At last Grey Beaver withheld his hand. White Fang, hanging limply, continued to cry. This seemed to satisfy his master, who flung him down roughly in the bottom of the canoe. In the meantime, the canoe had drifted down the stream. Grey Beaver picked up the paddle. White Fang was in his way. He spurned him savagely with his foot. In that moment, White Fang's free nature flashed forth again, and he sank his foot into the moccasin foot. The beating that had gone before was as nothing compared with the beating he now received. Grey Beaver's wrath was terrible. Likewise was White Fang's fright. Not only the hand, but the hard wooden paddle was used upon him, and he was bruised and sore in all his small body when he was again flung down in the canoe. Again, and this time with purpose, did Grey Beaver kick him. White Fang did not repeat his attack on the foot. He had learned another lesson of his bondage. Never, no matter what the circumstance, must he dare to bite the god who was lord and master over him. The body of the lord and master was sacred, not to be defiled by the teeth of such as he. That was evident there. The crime of crimes, the one offense there was no condoning nor overlooking. When the canoe touched the shore, White Fang lay whimpering and motionless, waiting the will of Grey Beaver. It was Grey Beaver's will that he should go ashore. For ashore he was flung, striking heavily on his side and hurting his bruise afresh. He crawled tremblingly to his feet and stood whimpering. Lip Lip, who had watched the whole proceeding from the bank, now rushed upon him, knocking him over and sinking his teeth into him. White Fang was too helpless to defend himself, and it would have gone hard with him had not Grey Beaver's foot shot out, lifting Lip Lip into the air, with its violence so that he smashed down to earth a dozen feet away. This was the man-animal's justice, and even then, in his own pitiable plight, White Fang experienced a little grateful thrill. At Gray Beaver's heels he limped, obediently through the village to the tepee, and so it came that White Fang learned that the right to punish was something the gods reserved for themselves, and denied to the lesser creatures under them. That night, when all was still, White Fang remembered his mother and sorrowed for her. He sorrowed too loudly, and awoke up Grey Beaver, who beat him. After that, he mourned gently when the gods were around. But sometimes, straying off to the edge of the woods by himself, he gave vent to his grief, and cried it out with loud whimperings and wailings. It was during this period that he might have hearkened to the memories of the lair and the stream and run back to the wild. But the memory of his mother held him as the hunting man-animals went out and came back. So she would come back to the village sometime. So he remained in his bondage waiting for her. But it was not, although altogether, an unhappy bondage. There was much to interest it. Something was always happening. There was no end to the strange things these gods did, and he was always curious to see. Besides, he was learning how to get along with Grey Beaver. Obedience, rigid, undeviating obedience, was what was exacted of him, and in return he escaped beatings, and his existence was tolerated. Nay, Grey Beaver himself sometimes tossed him a piece of meat, and defended him against the other dogs in the eating of it. And such a piece of meat was of value. It was worth more in some strange way than a dozen pieces of meat from the hand of a squaw. Grey Beaver never petted nor caressed. Perhaps it was the weight of his hand, perhaps his justice, perhaps the sheer power of him. Perhaps it was all of these things that influenced White Fang for a certain attachment. Tie of attachment was forming between him and his surly lord. Insidiously and by remote ways, as well as by the power of stick and stone and clout of hand, were the shackles of White Fang's bondage being riveted upon him. Qualities in his kind that in the beginning made it possible for them to come in to the fires of men were qualities capable of developing, they were developing in him, and the camp life, replete with misery as it was secretly endearing itself to him. All the time, but White Fang was unaware of it. He knew only grief for the loss of Quiche, hope for her return, and a hungry yearning for the free life that had been his. Chapter break. Chapter 3 The Outcast. Lip Lip continued so to darken his days that White Fang became wickeder and more ferocious than it was his natural right to be. Savageness was a part of his makeup, but the savageness thus developed exceeded his makeup. He acquired a reputation for wickedness amongst the man animals themselves. Wherever there was trouble and uproar in camp, fighting and squabbling of the outcry of a squaw over a bit of stolen meat, they were sure to find White Fang mixed up in it, and usually at the bottom of it. They did not bother to look after the causes of his conduct. They saw only the effects, and the effects were bad. He was a sneak and a thief, a mischief maker, a fomenter of trouble. And irate squaws told him to his face, the while he eyed them alert and ready to dodge any quick flung missile, that he was a wolf and worthless and bound to come to an evil end. He found himself an outcast in the midst of the populous camp. All the young dogs followed Lip Lip's lead. There was a difference between White Fang and them. Perhaps they sensed his wild wood breed and instinctively felt for him the enmity that the domestic dog feels for the wolf. But be that as it may, they joined with Lip Lip in the persecution and once declared against him. They found good reason to continue declared against him. One and all, from time to time, they felt his teeth, and to his credit, he gave more than he received. Many of them he could whip in single fight, but single fight was denied him. The beginning of such a fight was a signal for all the dogs in camp to come running and pitch upon him. One of this pack persecution he learned two out of this camp out of this pack persecution he learned two important things: how to take care of himself in a mass fight against him, and how on a single dog to inflict the greatest amount of damage in the briefest space of time. To keep one's feet in the midst of the hostile mass meant life, and this he learned well. He became cat-like in his ability to stay on his feet. Even grown dogs might hurtle him backward or sideways with the impact of their heavy bodies, and backward or sideways he would go, in the air or sliding on the ground, but always with his legs under him, and his feet downward to the Mother Earth. When dogs fight, there are usually preliminaries to the actual combat: snarlings and bristlings and stiff-legged strutterings. But White Fang learned to omit these preliminaries. Delay meant the coming against him of all the young dogs. He must do his work quite quickly and get away. So he learned to give no warning of his intention. He rushed in and snapped and slashed on the instant, without notice, before his foe could prepare to meet him. Thus he learned how to inflict quick and severe damage. Also, he learned the value of surprise. A dog taken off its guard, its shoulder slashed open, or its ear ripped in ribbons before it knew what was happening, was a dog half-wit. Furthermore, it was remarkably easy to overthrow a dog taken by surprise, while a dog thus overthrown invariably exposed for a moment the soft underside of its neck, the vulnerable point at which to strike for its life. White Fang knew this point. It was a knowledge bequeathed to him directly from the hunting generation of wolves. So it was that White Fang's method, when he took the offensive, was first to find a young dog alone. Give me one moment. Second, to surprise it and knock it off its feet. And third, to drive in with his teeth at the soft throat. Being but partly grown, his jaws had not yet become large enough nor strong enough to make his throat attack deadly. But many a young dog went around camp with a lacerated throat in token of White Fang's intention, and one day, catching one of his enemies alone on the edge of the woods, he managed by repeatedly overthrowing him and attacking the throat to cut the great vein and let out the life. There was a great row that night. He had been observed, the news had been carried to the dead dog's master. The squaws remembered all the instances of stolen meat, and Grey Beaver was beset by many angry voices. But he resolutely held the door of his tepee inside which he had placed the culprit, and refused to permit the vengeance for which his tribe's people clamored. White Fang became hated by man and dog during this period of his development. He never knew a moment's security. The tooth of every dog was against him. The hand of every man. He was greeted with his snarls. He was greeted with snarls by his kind, with curses and stones by his gods. He lived tensely. He was always keyed up, always for attack, wary of being attacked, with an eye for sudden and unexpected missiles, prepared to act precipitately and coolly, to leap in with a flash of teeth, or to leap away with menacing snarl. As for snarling, he could snarl more terribly than any dog, young or old, in camp. The intent of the snarl is to warn or frighten, and judgment is required to know when it should be used. White Fang knew how to make it, and when to make it. Into his snarl he incorporated all that was vicious, malignant, and horrible. With nose serrated by contingent spasms, hair bristling in recurrent waves, tongue whipping out like a red snake and whipping back again, ears flattened down, eyes gleaming hatred, lips wrinkled back, and fangs exposed and dripping, he could compel a pause on the part of almost any assailant. A temporary pause when taken off his guard gave him the vital moment in which to think and determine his action, but often a pause so gained lengthened out until it evolved into a complete secession from the attack, and before more than one of the grown dog's White Fang's snarl enabled him to beat an honorable retreat. An outcast himself from the pack of the pot-grown dogs, his sanguinary methods and remarkable efficiency made the pack pay for its persecution of him, not permitted himself to run with the pack. The curious state of affairs obtained that no member of the pack could run outside the pack. White Fang could not permit it. What of his bushwhacking and waylaying tactics? The young dogs were afraid to run by themselves with the exception of Liplet. They were compelled to hunch together for mutual protection against the terrible enemy they had made. A puppy alone by the river bank meant a puppy dead or a puppy that aroused the camp with its shrill pain and terror as it fled back from the wolf cub that had waylaid it. But White Fang's reprisals did not cease. Even when the young dogs had learned thoroughly that they must stay together, he attacked them when he caught them alone, and they attacked him when they were bunched. The sight of him was sufficient to start them rushing after him, at which times his swiftness usually carried him into safety. But woe the dog that outran his fellows in such pursuit. White Fang had learned to turn suddenly upon the pursuer that was ahead of the pack, and thoroughly to rip him up before the pack could arrive. This occurred with great frequency, for once in full cry, The dogs were prone to forget themselves in the excitement of the chase, while White Fang never forgot himself. Stealing backward glances as he ran, he was always ready to whirl around and down the overzealous pursuer that outran his fellows. Young dogs are bound to play, and out of the existence, exigencies of the situation, they realized that play in this mimic warfare. Thus it was that the hunt of White Fang became their chief game, a deadly game, with all and at all times a serious game. He, on the other hand, being fastest footed, was unafraid to venture anywhere. During the period that he waited vainly for his mother to come back, he led the pack many a wild chase through the adjacent woods. But the pack invariably lost him. Its noise and outcry warned him of its presence, while he ran alone, velvet-footed, silently a moving shadow among the trees, after the manner of his father and mother before him. Further, he was more directly connected with the wild than they, and he knew more of its secrets and stratagems. A favorite trick of his was to lose his trail in running water, and then lie quietly in a nearby thicket, while their baffled cries arose around him. Hated by his kind and by manhood, indomitable, indomitable perpetually warred about upon and himself waging perpetual war, his development was rapid and one-sided. This was no soil for kindliness and affection to blossom in. Of such things he had not the faintest glimmering. The code he learned was to obey the strong and to oppress the weak. Grey Beaver was a god, and strong, therefore White Fang obeyed him. But the dog himself was weak, a thing to be destroyed. His development was in the direction of power. In order to face the constant danger of hurt and even of destruction, his predatory and protective faculties were unduly developed. He became quicker of movement than the other dogs, swifter of foot, craftier, deadlier, more lithe, more lean, with iron-like muscle and sinew more enduring, more cruel, more ferocious, and more intelligent. He had to become all these things, else he would not held his own nor survived the hostile environment in which he found himself. Chapter break. Chapter 4. The Trail of the Gods. In the fall of the year, when the days were shortening and the bite of the frost was coming into the air, White Fang got his chance for liberty. For several days there had been a great hubbub in the village. The summer camp was being dismantled, and the tribe and baggage was preparing to go off to the fall hunting. White Fang watched it all with eager eyes, and when the teepees began to come down and the canoes were loading at the bank, he understood. Already the canoes were just departing, and some had appeared down the river. Quite deliberately he determined to stay behind. He waited his opportunity to slink out of camp to the woods. Here in the running stream where ice was beginning to form, he hid his trail. Then he crawled into the heart of a dense thicket and waited. The time passed by and he slept intermittently for hours. Then he was aroused by Grey Beaver's voice calling him by name. There were other voices. White Fang could hear Grey Beaver's squaw taking part in the search, and Mitsa, who was Grey Beaver's son. White Fang trembled with fear and through the impulse came to crawl out of his hiding place. He resisted it. After a time, the voices died away, and some time after that he crept out to enjoy the success of his undertaking. Darkness was coming on, and for a while he played about among the trees, pleasuring in his freedom. Then, and quite suddenly, he became aware of loneliness. He sat down to consider, listening to the silence of the forest, and perturbed by it. That nothing moved nor sounded seemed ominous. He felt the lurking of danger, unseen and unguessed. He was suspicious of the looming bulks of the trees and of the dark shadows that might conceal all manner of perilous things. Then it was a cold Then it was cold. Here no warm side of a teepee against which to snuggle. The frost was in his feet, and he kept lifting one forefoot and then the other. He curved his bushy tail around to cover them, and at the same time he saw a vision. There was nothing strange about it. Upon his inward sight was impressed a succession of memory pictures. He saw the camp again, the teepees and the blaze of the fires. He heard the shrill voices of the women, the gruff basses of the men, and the snarling of the dogs. He was hungry, and he remembered pieces of meat and fish that had been thrown him. Here was no meat, nothing but a threatening and inedible silence. His bondage had softened him. Irresponsibility had weakened him. He had forgotten how to shift for himself. The night yawned about him, his senses accustomed to the hum and bustle of the camp. Used to the continuous impact of sights and sounds, were now left idle. There was nothing left to do, nothing to see nor hear. They strained to catch some interruption of the silence and immobility of nature. They were appalled by inaction and by the feel of something terrible impending. He gave a great start of fright. A colossal and formless something was rushing across the field of his vision. It was a tree shadow flung by the moon, from whose face the clouds had been brushed away. Reassured, he whimpered softly. Then he suppressed the whimper for fear that it might attract the attention of the lurking dangers. A tree contracting in the cool of the night made a loud noise. It was directly above him. He yelped in his fright. A panic seized him, and it and he ran madly towards the village. He knew an overpowering desire for the protection and companionship of man. In his nostrils was the smell of the camp smoke. In his ears the camp sounds and cries were ringing loud. He passed out of the forest and into the moonlight. Upon open where were no shadows nor darknesses. But no village greeted his eyes. He had forgotten the village had gone away. His wild flight ceased abruptly. There was no place to which to flee. He slunk forlornly through the deserted camp, smelling smelling the rubbish heaps and the discarded rags and tags of the gods, he would have been glad for the rattle of stones about him. Flung by an angry squaw, glad for the hand of Greybeaver descending upon him in wrath, while he would have welcomed with delight Lip Lip and the snarling cowardly pack, he came to where Greybeaver's teepee had stood. In the center of the space it had occupied he sat down. He pointed his nose at the moon. His throat was afflicted by rigid spasms. His mouth open, and in the heartbroken cry bubbled up his loneliness and fear, his grief for Quiche, all his past sorrows and miseries, as well as his apprehension of sufferings and dangers to come. It was the long wolf howl, full-throated and mournful, the first howl he had ever uttered. The coming of daylight dispelled his fears, but increased his loneliness. The naked earth, which so shortly before had been so populous, thrust his loneliness more forcibly upon him. It did not take him long to make up his mind. He plunged into the forest and followed the river bank down. The stream, all day he ran. He did not rest. He seemed made to run on forever. His iron-like body ignored fatigue, and even after fatigue came, his heritage of endurance braced him to endless endeavor and enabled him to drive his complaining body onward, where the river swung in against precipitous bluffs. He climbed the high mountains behind, river and streams that entered the main river he forded or swam. Often he took to the rim ice that was beginning to form, and more than once he crashed through and struggled for life in the icy current. Always he was on the lookout for the trail of the gods, where it might leave the river and proceeded inland. White Fang was intelligent beyond the average of his kind, yet his mental vision was not wide enough to embrace the other bank of the Mackenzie. What if the trail of the gods led out on the other side, on that side? It never entered his head. Later on, when he had traveled more and grown older and wiser, and come to know more of trails and rivers, it might be that he could grasp and apprehend such a possibility, but that mental power was yet in the future. Just now he ran blindly his own bank of the ran Mackenzie alone, entering into his calculations. All night he ran, blundering in the darkness into mishaps and obstacles that delayed but did not daunt. By the middle of the second day he had been running continuously for 30 hours, and the iron of his flesh was giving out. It was the endurance of his mind that kept him going. He had not eaten in 40 hours, and he was weak with hunger. The repeated drenchings in the icy water had likewise had their effect on him. His handsome coat was straggled, the broad pads of his feet were bruised and bleeding. He had begun to limp, and the limp increased with the hours to make it worse. The light of the sky was obscured, and snow began to fall. A raw, moist, melting, clinging snow, slippery underfoot, that hid from him the landscape he traversed, and that covered over the inequalities of the ground, so that the way of his feet was more difficult and painful. Greybeaver had intended camping that night on the far bank of the Mackenzie, for it was in that direction that the hunting lay, but on the near bank. Shortly before dark, a moose coming down to drink had been espied by Clew Cooch, who was Greybeaver's squaw. Now had not the moose come down to drink, had not Mitsa been steering out of the course. Because of the snow, had not Cooch sighted the moose and had not Grey Beaver killed it with a lucky shot from his rifle, all subsequent things would have happened differently. Grey Beaver would not have camped out on the near side of the Mackenzie, and White Fang wouldn't have passed by and gone on either to die or to find his way to his wild brothers and become one of them, a wolf to the end of his days. Night had fallen, the snow had flying was flying more thickly, and White Fang, whimpering softly to himself as he stumbled and limped along, came upon a fresh trail in the snow. So fresh was it that he knew it immediately for what it was. Whining with eagerness, he followed back from the river bank, and in among the trees the camp sounded come to his ears. He saw the blaze of the fire, Blue Cooch cooking the Grey Beaver and Blue Cooch cooking and Grey Beaver squatting on his hams and mumbling a chunk of raw tallow. There was fresh meat in camp. White Fang expected a beating. He crouched and bristled a little at the thought of it. Then he went forward again. He feared and disliked the beating he knew to be waiting for him, but he knew further that the comfort of the fire would be his, the protection of the gods, the companionship of the dogs, the last, a companionship of enmity, but none the less a companionship, and satisfying to his gregarious needs. He came cringing and crawling into the firelight. Grey Beaver saw him and stopped munching the tallow. White Fang crawled slowly, cringing and groveling in the abjectness of his abasement and submission. He crawled straight towards Grey Beaver, every inch of his progress becoming slower and more painful. At last he lay at his master's feet, into whose possession he now surrendered himself, voluntarily, body and soul, of his own choice. He came in to sit by man's fire and to be ruled by him. White Fang trembled, waiting for the punishment to fall upon him. There was a movement of the hand above him. He cringed involuntarily under the expected blow. It did not fall. He stole a glance upward. Grey Beaver was breaking the lump of tallow in half. Grey Beaver was offering him one piece of the tallow. Very gently and somewhat suspiciously, he first smelled the tallow and then proceeded to eat it. Grey Beaver ordered meat to be brought to him, and guarded him from the other dogs while he ate. After that, grateful and content, White Fang lay at Grey Beaver's feet, gazing at the fire that warmed him, blinking and dozing, secure in the knowledge that the morrow would find him not wandering forlorn through bleak forest stretches, but in the camp of the man animals, with the gods to whom he had given himself and upon whom he was now dependent. Chapter break. Chapter 5. The Covenant. When December was well along, Grey Beaver went on a journey up the Mackenzie. Mitsa and Fluk Hooch went with him. One sled he drove himself, drawn by dogs he had traded for or borrowed. A second and smaller sled was driven by Mitsa, and to this was harnessed a team of puppies. It was more of a toy affair than anything else, yet it was the delight of Mitsa, who felt that he was beginning to do a man's work in this in the world. Also, he was learning to drive dogs and to train dogs, while the puppies themselves were being broken into the harness. Furthermore, the sled was of some service, for it carried nearly 200 pounds of outfit and food. White Fang had seen the camp dogs toiling in the harness, so that he did not resent overmuch the first placing of the harness upon himself. About his neck was put a moss-stuffed collar, which was connected by two pulling traces to a strap that passed around his chest. And over his back it was to this that was fastened the long rope by which he pulled at the sled. There were 7 puppies in the team. The others had been born earlier in the year, and were 9 and 10 months old, while White Fang was only 8 months old. Each dog was fastened to the sled of a single rope. No two ropes were of the same length. The differences in length between any two ropes was at least that of a dog's body. Every rope was brought to a ring at the front end of the sled. The sled itself was without runners, being a birch bark toboggan, with upturned front forward end to keep it from plowing under the snow. This construction enabled the weight of the sled and load to be distributed over the largest snow surface. For the snow was crystal powder and very soft. Observing the very principle of widest distribution of weight, the dogs at the ends of their ropes radiated fan fashioned from the nose of the sled, so that no dog trotted in another's footsteps. There was furthermore another virtue in the fan formation. The ropes of varying lengths prevented the dogs attacking from the rear those that ran in front of them. For a dog to attack another, it would have to turn upon one at a shorter rope, in which case it would find itself face to face with the dog attacked, and also it would find itself facing the whip of the driver. But the most peculiar virtue of all lay in the fact that the dog that strove to attack one in front of him must pull the sled faster, and that the faster the sled traveled, the faster could the dog attacked run away. Thus the dog behind could never catch up with the one in front. The faster he ran, the faster ran the one he was after, and the faster ran all the dogs. Incidentally, the sled went faster, and thus by cunning indirection did man increase his mastery over the beast. Mitsa resembled his father, much of whose grey wisdom he possessed. In the past he had observed Lip Lip's persecution of White Fang, but at that time Lip Lip was another man's dog. But Mitsa had never dared more than to shy an occasional stone at him. But now Lip Lip was his dog, and he proceeded to wreak his vengeance on him by putting him at the end of the longest rope. This made Lip Lip the leader and was apparently an honor, but in reality it took away from him all honor, and instead of being bully and master of the pack, he now found himself hated and persecuted by the pack. Because he ran at the end of the longest rope, the dogs had always the view of him running away before them. All that they saw of him was his bushy tail and fleeing hind legs, a view far less ferocious and intimidating than his bristling mane and gleaming fangs. Also, dogs being so constituted in their mental ways, the sight of him running away gave desire to run after him, and a feeling that he ran away from them. The moment the sled started, the team took after Lip Lip in a chase that extended throughout the day. At first he had been prone to turn upon his pursuers, jealous of his dignity and wrathful, but at such times Mitsa would throw the stinging lash of the 30-foot caribou gut whip into his face, and compel him to turn tail and run on. Lip Lip might face the pack, but he could not face that whip, and all that was left him to do was to keep his long rope taut, and his flanks ahead of the teeth of his mates. But a still greater cunning lurked in the recesses of the Indian mind. To give point to unending pursuit of the leader, Mitsa favored him over the other dogs. These favors aroused in them jealousy and hatred. In their presence, Mitsa would give him meat, and would give it to him only. This was maddening to them. They would rage around just outside the throwing distance of the whip, while Lip Lip devoured the meat, and Mitsa protected him. And when there was no meat to give, Mitsa would keep the team at a distance, and make believe to give meat to Lip Lip. White Fang took kindly to the work. He had traveled a greater distance than the other dogs in the yielding of himself to the rule of the gods, and he had learned more thoroughly the futility of opposing their will. In addition, the persecution he had suffered from the pack had made the pack less to him, in the scheme of things, and man more. He had not learned to be dependent on his kind for companionship. Besides who Quiche was well nigh forgotten, and the chief outlet of expression that remained to him was in the allegiance he tendered the gods he had accepted as masters. So he worked hard, learned discipline, and was obedient. Faithfulness and willingness characterized his toil. These are essential traits of the wolf and the wild dog that when they have become domesticated, and these traits White Fang possessed in unusual measure. A companionship did exist between White Fang and the other dogs, but it was one of warfare and enmity. He had never learned to play with them, he knew only how to fight, and fight with them he did, returning to them 100-fold the snaps and lashes they had given him in the days when Lip Lip was leader of the pack. But Lip Lip was no longer leader except when he fled away before his mates at the end of his rope. The sled bounding along behind in camp, he kept close to Mitsa, or Grey Beaver, or Clucooch. He did not dare venture away from the gods, for now the fangs of all dogs were against him, and he tasted to the dregs the persecution that had been White Fang's. With the overthrow of Lip Lip, White Fang could have become leader of the pack, but he was too morose and solitary for that. He merely thrashed his teammates, otherwise he ignored them. They got out of his way. When he came along, nor did the boldest of them ever dare to rob him of his meat. On the contrary, they devoured their own meat hurriedly for fear that he would take it away from them. White Fang knew the law well, to oppress the weak and obey the strong. He ate his share of meat as rapidly as he could, and then woe the dog that had not yet finished. A snarl and a flash of fangs, and that dog would wheel his indignation to the uncomfortable stares while White Fang finished his portion for him. Every little while, however, one dog or another would flame up in revolt and be promptly subdued. Thus, White Fang was kept in training. He was jealous of the isolation in which he kept himself in the midst of the pack, and he fought often to maintain it. But such fights were of brief duration. He was too quick for the others. They were slashed open and bleeding before they knew what had happened. They whipped almost before they had begun to fight. As rigid as the sled discipline of the gods was the discipline maintained by White Fang amongst his fellows. He never allowed them any latitude. He compelled them to an unremitting respect for him. They might do as they pleased amongst themselves. That was no concern of his, but it was his concern that they leave him alone in his isolation, get out of his way when he elected to walk among them, and at all times acknowledge his mastery over them. A hint of stiff-leggedness or their part, a lifted lip or a bristle of hair, and he would be upon them, merciless and cruel, swiftly convincing them of the error of their ways. He was a monstrous tyrant. His mastery was rigid as steel. He oppressed the weak with a vengeance. Not for nothing had he been exposed to the pitiless struggle for life in the days of his cubhood. When his mother and he, alone and unaided, held their own and survived in the ferocious environment of the wild, and not for nothing he had learned to walk softly when superior strength went by. He oppressed the weak, but he respected the strong, and in the course of the long journey with Grey Beaver, he walked softly indeed. Amongst the full-grown dogs in the camps of the strange man animals they encountered. The months passed by, still continued the journey of Grey Beaver. White Fang's strength was developed by the long hours on trail and the steady toil at the sled, and it would have seemed that his mental development was well nigh complete. He had come to know quite thoroughly the world in which he lived. His outlook was bleak and materialistic. The world as he saw it was a fierce and brutal world, a world without warmth, a world in which caresses and affection and the bright sweetness of the spirit did not exist. He had no affection for Grey Beaver. True, he was a god, but a most savage god. White Fang was glad to acknowledge his lordship, but it was a lordship based upon superior intelligence and brute strength. There was something in the fibre of White Fang's being that made this lordship a thing to be desired. Else he would not have come back from the wild when he did to tender his allegiance. There were deeps in his nature which had never been sounded. A kind word, a pressing touch of the hand on the part of Grey Beaver might have sounded these deeps, but Grey Beaver did not caress, nor speak kind words. It was not his way. His primacy was savage, and savagely he ruled, administering justice with a club, punishing transgressions with the pain of a blow, and rewarding merit, not by kindness, but by withholding a blow. So White Fang knew nothing of the heaven a man's hand might contain for him. Besides, he did not like the hands of the man-animals. He was suspicious of them. It was true that they sometimes gave meat, but more often than they gave hurt. Hands were things to keep away from. They hurled stones, wielded sticks and clubs, and... One moment. Administered slaps and claps, and when they touched him, were cunning to hurt with pinch and twist and wrench. In strange villages he had encountered the hands of the children and learned that they were cruel to hurt. Also, he had once nearly had an eye poked out by a toddling papoose. From these experiences he became suspicious of all children. He could not tolerate them. When they came near with their ominous hands, he got up. It was in a village at the Great Slave Lake that, in the course of resenting the evil of the checking how long we have until the next chapter. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end it there. I was trying to do an even amount for I'm going to end it here.
Uh, right. I'm trying to do an even amount for the month, so we're going to end a bit abruptly there. Right now, thank you everyone for watching. Have a great night. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all on tomorrow for Kingdom Hearts 3. Um, Let me go ahead and see who else is streaming so we can set off for a good raid. A lot of people a lot of people streaming today. I usually try to go for who has the least amount of viewers, and so that's why I'm going to go ahead and raid off to someone else. I'll repeat what I said because I'm sure it got cut off because whenever I'm not on the stream, yeah, uh, a lot of people are streaming today, so I'm going to go ahead and raid off to Sugar. Bomb VR. I usually try to go ahead and raid off to whoever has the fewest amount of watchers at the moment, and Sugar is at a respectful 7 viewers. However, they're at the bottom end of the list. So let's go ahead and raid off to Sugar, and I'll see you all on tomorrow for that Kingdom Hearts 3 stream at 2 o'clock EST. Right now, please give love and support to Sugar, and I'll see you all later.